A few weeks ago, I decided I was going to try and do something spontaneous and took a solo trip to Barcelona for the weekend. I had arrived with a camera, a small bag of essentials, and a vague sense of the goals I was attempting to both achieve and discover. However, as I got further into the weekend, my initial plan of making a video out of my experience dwindled. I had done my research, I knew the places I needed to go, the things I needed to see, in order to get the elements I would need to somehow render this pointless exercise in exploration into something meaningful. But I failed. Instead, what came of the whole weekend was wandering to random areas, seeing random things, and attempting to speak to random people. And as I reflected on this wandering whilst on my flight home in the late evening of the following Monday, I couldn't help but think, what was the point? For a long time, I have been intrigued by travel writers, or should I say, descriptions of travel by writers who have travelled. This fact wasn't even immediately apparent to me, but as I have continued to read throughout the years, I noticed a pattern of finding immense joy in well-crafted descriptions of landscapes, areas, and environments. Whether it's George Orwell's accounts of the mountains at daybreak on the Aragon front in Homage to Catalonia, Ernest Hemingway's portrayal of the cafes in Paris stretching out onto the pavements in The Sun Also Rises, or the sweeping scenery out the windows of the trains depicted in Thomas Wolfe's Look Homeward Angel and of Time and the River, I noticed how all descriptions seemed to stay in my mind more than the stories themselves. And so, upon dejectedly returning home, I sought out the advice, the goals, the point these writers and some other cultural figures ascribed to travel, and how they could devise a way of creating something seemingly out of what felt like thin air. What I found led to this video, an exploration of the art of travel and travel writers, and what I discovered is that they all seem to find a purpose, a meaning, or a point, sometimes in retrospect, to their minimally planned, minimally coordinated, and seemingly pointless ventures. Maybe this video is my attempt at finding mine. On the 24th of April 1895, American seaman and writer Joshua Slocum embarked on what would become an over 46,000-mile solo circumnavigation of the Earth in his trusty sailboat, the Spray. Slocum began his journey in Boston, Massachusetts, and it ended when he arrived in Fairhaven, Massachusetts on the 27th of June 1898, an arrival overshadowed by the Spanish-American War, which had broken out in April of the same year. Fortunately, the war lasted no more than 10 weeks, thus allowing the American papers to retrospectively report on Slocum's accomplishment of being the first person in history to circumnavigate the globe on his own. This seemingly impossible venture Slocum undertook had garnered him fame during his travels, and upon returning home, he began writing what was to become a travel memoir detailing his experiences while sailing 46,000 miles around the globe. The memoir was thus published in the year 1900 and was given the apt title Sailing Alone Around the World. In the book, Slocum details the highs and lows whilst on his journey in a surprisingly quick-witted and charmingly sarcastic first-person account. He describes his departure from the starting line in Boston, Massachusetts as such. I had resolved on a voyage around the world, and as the wind on the morning of April 24th, 1895 was fair, at noon I weighed anchor, set sail, and filled away from Boston, where the Spray had been moored snugly all winter. The 12 o'clock whistles were blowing just as the sloop shot ahead under full sail. A short board was made up the harbour on the port tack. Then coming about, she stood to seaward, with her boom well off the port, and swung past the ferries with lively heels. A photographer on the outer pier of East Boston got a picture of her as she swept by, her flag at the peak throwing her folds clear. A thrilling pulse beat high in me. My step was light on deck in the crisp air. I felt there could be no turning back, and that I was engaging in an adventure the meaning of which I thoroughly understood. From here, the 200 plus page memoir retells Slocum's experiences with what he refers to as savages that try to steal from him, near-death experiences while sailing through heavy storms, accounts of fending off attackers with his rifle, and detailed descriptions of frequent bouts of loneliness during downtimes. Yet, despite the daily threats of danger and occasional streaks of bad luck, the memoir is permeated with humour. An example of Slocum's humour is shown when he recounts the time a goat was gifted to him by an American called Clark while Slocum was moored at St. Helena Island. When Slocum set off from St. Helena and retreated to his cabin to work on his travel logs, he had the newly gifted goat tied up on the deck of the Spray. Unbeknownst to Slocum, whilst he was working, the goat had chewed his way through the rope Slocum had used to tie him to the deck, and once free, the goat ate Slocum's only map of the West Indies and his straw hat. Finding two very important possessions destroyed, the goat was thus killed. Yet when reflecting on this small episode, Slocum would humorously pen that this goat was the worst pirate he met whilst on his voyage. Lastly, in the book, Slocum also balances out the lows of the trip with the highs. These highs being the thrill of the adventure at hand, the frequent acts of kindness Slocum was shown whilst moored in various parts of the world, meeting the wife of writer Robert L. Stevenson, Slocum's unremitted love of the sea and sailing, and finally, Slocum's almost reverential respect towards the one constant throughout his venture, his trusty sailboat, the Spray. The publishing of Sailing Alone Around the World was received well, and Slocum became famous as a result. Slocum had made a lot of money in sales of his book too, and with the money garnered, he purchased a farm on the island of Martha's Vineyard in Massachusetts. However, not long after this purchase, Slocum became bored with a moored life and would sail again in the Spray to various countries to give lectures and sell books. In later years, Slocum befriended US President Theodore Roosevelt, and Slocum would inform Roosevelt of his plans to sail in the Spray once again, but this time he was heading for Venezuela and to the Amazon River. And thus, on November 14th, 1909, Slocum began his voyage and set sail for the West Indies, and he was never seen again. By July 10th, 1910, Slocum's wife informed the papers that Slocum was believed to have been lost at sea. 14 years later, in 1924, Joshua Slocum was legally pronounced dead. The most interesting thing I think you can take away from Slocum's story is not necessarily the disappearance, the writing, nor the fact that this guy was the first person to circumnavigate the globe on his own. No, instead, what interests me the most about Slocum's story was his decision to go back out into the sea again. Slocum had cheated death numerous times whilst on his solo journey around the world, and despite being an expert sailor with a powerful memory of landmarks and locations, two skill sets that boosted his chances of survival more than the average sailor, there was always an element of luck involved in his survival, and I'm sure he knew this. Yet, regardless of his scrapes with death whilst on his voyage, whether to pirates trying to rob him or the heavy storms that almost drowned him, Slocum still wanted to get back out into the sea, back out into the action, and back out into the Spray. And that ultimately was his demise, his inability to cash in his chips. This inability to stay still is a common theme amongst extensive travellers, and it is understandable. There is always something else to see, places to go, and things to figure out. So why wouldn't you feel obligated to get back out moving, instead of staying in one place? It makes sense. However, for those that do go back out time and time again, what do they bring back? What do they learn from their travels that cannot be learnt from a documentary or a book? Few people in this world are well equipped to answer this question, as there are so few with a platform that have travelled as close to everywhere as I believe the next two people have. Henry Rollins is a musician, writer, actor, radio host, spoken word performer, and traveller, who got his start in the world of entertainment in 1981 when he auditioned for the role of lead singer in the American hardcore punk band Black Flag. To most, Rollins' name is probably associated with his intense musical career with Black Flag and the Henry Rollins Band, beginning in the early 80s and ending somewhere in the early 2000s. However, today, those who go to see Rollins perform on a stage don't witness a shirtless, tatted up, muscle-bound man screaming lyrics into a microphone. Instead, they get a politically charged, widely travelled, articulate orator who tells stories of his experiences whilst venturing around the world. Rollins' love of travel began during his time touring in Black Flag, as the band would constantly tour the US and Europe for shows, and would rarely stop to take a breather unless they were recording an album. During Rollins' time in the band, which lasted from 1981 to 86, the year the band broke up, he would write about his experiences both on the road and at the chaotic shows in a journal, which he later comprised into a book, released in 1994 called Get in the Van. Get in the Van was a success, and was one of Rollins' first forays into publishing accounts of his experiences whilst travelling. By the time of the book's release, Rollins likely would have been considered well travelled due to his extensive touring both for his spoken word shows and concerts. However, when talking to a journalist in the late 1990s who said to Rollins, "You do a lot of travel," Rollins pointed out how he actually hadn't, as he had never been to Africa. Rollins has since explained how touring can only get you so far in the world. It can get you through the US, most of Europe, parts of Japan, Australia, etc., but it was never going to get you to areas like Africa or the Middle East. Regardless, this small comment seemed to plant a seed in Rollins' mind, as he began to question himself on why he hadn't gone to Africa anyway, and thus set off in 1997 to Kenya, Madagascar, and South Africa. Rollins would subsequently document his experiences and publish them in the third part of the Black Coffee Blues trilogy called Smile, You're Travelling, and henceforth has returned to Africa more or less every year. This journey to Africa gave Rollins a new purpose when travelling, as he had now not been reliant on a preset show to await him at his destination, and instead was free to take a more relaxed approach and learn more about the area in which he was in. At the time, Rollins would have still been figuring out his travel philosophy. However, today, after decades of honing and putting this philosophy into action, he has a clear idea of what he tries to get out of his travels. Rollins' travel philosophy can be boiled down to refusing to fear the world. Rollins has often cited his government as the inspiration behind the areas he visits, as he likes to go wherever his government advises him against going to, in order to find out whether he is being lied to. Once at these locations, Rollins takes a very situational approach to his venturing. He will drop off his equipment in his hotel room, walk into the streets, point in a direction, and simply go follow it. Rollins has stated that he is typically approached by the locals of most countries he visits, who try to offer him assistance, assuming he is lost. Once Rollins responds that he is in fact not lost and is just a traveller, the local will often ask him, "Then why are you here?" To which Rollins will use his trusty icebreaker, "I'm here to meet you." Rollins has implemented this very simplistic and situational philosophy all over the world, and claims that he has never been in any real danger, and that in fact, the 2 times in his life where he has very nearly been killed were in the US. Rollins has also attributed travel to humbling him and making him a calmer, more empathetic and less cynical person, as he has been blown away by the incredible acts of kindness shown him by those who are far less fortunate than himself. He has become a champion of the resilience of the Homo sapien. These days, Rollins continues to travel the globe and talk of his experiences on his spoken word tours. He is an advocate of travel, a believer in the idea that experiencing the world with sense, openness, and a willingness to learn, including the areas which your government advises against, is truly the one and only great anti-war deterrent. Another icon whose blend of punk rebellion mixed with literate and intellectually stimulating opinions on travel's many benefits is the late chef turned writer turned travel show host, Anthony Bourdain. In the year 2000, Anthony Bourdain released a memoir of his experiences as a chef called Kitchen Confidential. The book was an immediate success and made Bourdain famous, resulting in an offer from producers Lydia Tenalia and Chris Collins for Bourdain to be the frontman in a travel show based on Bourdain's follow-up book he was researching called A Cook's Tour. A Cook's Tour aired between 2002 to 2003 and ran for 2 seasons. The premise of the show was that Bourdain, who at the beginning was known as the chef who wrote Kitchen Confidential, ventures around the world trying different countries' cuisines in search of the perfect meal. The show was relatively harmless, and the ratings were pretty good, which allowed Bourdain and crew to move and create a new show that had evidently evolved, but still held the A Cook's Tour foundations. The show was called No Reservations, and it was on an episode of this show that Bourdain's role as a traveller and TV show host became far more important than just eating food. The episode aired on August 21st, 2006 and was set in the city of Beirut, in Lebanon. Bourdain and crew arrived in Beirut in July 2006. The episode was going to be like any other. Bourdain was going to showcase Beirut in its, at the time, flourishing state by interacting with the locals, embracing the culture, and eating the local cuisines. Next, they would throw in some editorial or musical component typical of a Bourdain show, and boom, they were done. However, that component proved to be more deadly and impactful than any edits or obscure homage. It was war. 3 days into filming, Israel began bombing Beirut in response to a kidnapping. Bourdain and crew were thus stuck in Beirut, and essentially watched a war unfold right in front of them, whilst they tried to find a way out. Fortunately, after over a week of listening to the bombings going off outside their hotel, the crew was evacuated by US authorities. Upon returning to the US, Bourdain's initial reaction was to say that he didn't want to make a show out of what they had experienced. But after some convincing, they did, and the episode won awards, and turned out to be a game changer for Bourdain and crew, as they felt as if they had almost been given permission to go deeper than just food, and to occasionally forget the food aspect of the show entirely. When discussing the Beirut episode in 2016, Bourdain remarked upon its significance in allowing him to not feel as if he had to stick food in the show for it to be a Bourdain show. It gave us license to wander away from food a bit. We started to say, it's sort of obscene to try to shoehorn food in every scene. Food's super important. It's the way we get people to say things to us. That willingness to accept food and drink from strangers. Food and drink that people are often very proud of. That gets us a lot. People open up and their defenses drop. But it's not everything. Bourdain's purpose for his shows had subsequently gone beyond the food on his plate and found itself exploring social and political issues whilst using food as the great leveller. Having this new purpose, Bourdain went into his final show, Parts Unknown, trying to balance food and humanity, culminating in him visiting places with political or social tensions such as Libya, Cuba, Haiti, Liberia, Iraq, Israel, and once again, to Beirut. Over time, Bourdain became known for his respectful approach towards different cultures, and his ability to face the uncomfortable truths of our world without sensationalism. Bourdain also became a standard through which travellers would set themselves up against. He championed removing yourself from your comfort zone whilst on your travels, by simply trying new food, being open to experience, not being rigid in your plans, and doing so with an open mind. Yet, self-admittedly, Bourdain was not born an open and selfless character. In fact, for the majority of his life, he was quite the opposite, and he was also a fervent hater of humanity. As a man who had travelled almost everywhere, Bourdain would often get asked what he learned from his extensive travels, and how it has changed him. His answer to these questions was often simple. He learnt the world is full of people doing their best. Bourdain also credited the overwhelming displays of kindness and hospitality he experienced whilst travelling as altering his previously held negative opinions on the human race. For Rollins and Bourdain, travelling extensively, learning that the way you live is not necessarily the right way, and facing the uncomfortable truths of the world helped both men to bring back a sense of humility to their own lives. Both men had ventured to areas of the world with buzzwords associated with them, like lawless, unsafe, third world, etc., yet returned with more faith in humanity than when they went. Rollins and Bourdain were both cynical people before they travelled, and it was travel that gave them the perspective to be able to make the connection that fundamentally we are all the same. We want good food, clean water, good housing, and to be able to live comfortably. It's simple, yet it needs reminding. This is not to say that these two men would claim the world is sunshine and rainbows, because it's not, but that does not mean you should fear it. With openness, humbleness, smarts, and a willingness to learn, you can get by on your travels, and maybe, through implementing these simple rules on your next venture, you may someday look at the messages of both Rollins and Bourdain and say to yourself, they were right. But regardless, I believe Bourdain summed up this dichotomy of travel better than anyone when he wrote, "Travel isn't always pretty. It isn't always comfortable. Sometimes it hurts. It even breaks your heart. But that's okay. The journey changes you. It should change you. It leaves marks on your memory, on your consciousness, on your heart, and on your body. You take something with you. Hopefully, you leave something good behind." Lastly, when you want the question, what is the purpose of the travel writer, answered, you should look to none other than Paul Theroux, a man Bourdain actually interviewed in the Hawaii episode of Parts Unknown. Paul Theroux is the most famous modern day travel writer around and is credited with revitalising the genre in the mid-70s. Theroux's journey began when he graduated from the University of Massachusetts in 1963 and moved to Italy, and shortly after, to Africa. In Africa, Theroux worked as a Peace Corps teacher in Malawi and a lecturer at Makerere University in Uganda. In 1968, Theroux taught in the Department of English at the University of Singapore and did so for 3 years. Theroux moved to London in November 1971, having written for many journals by this point and having a few books published, but with a very small amount financially to show for it. He was at a loss for what to do, and one day, after careful consultation of a timetable of railway information throughout Europe, set off on a 4-month railway journey, starting in England from London's Victoria Station to Tokyo Central in Japan, and back via the Trans-Siberian Railway. Whilst on his journey, Theroux made notes of his experience, and upon returning he began writing what would become the Great Railway Bazaar. The book sold 1.5 million copies upon its release, and, despite it being his first travel book, it marked the beginning of Theroux's name as the most famous modern-day travel writer. Following the release of the Great Railway Bazaar, Theroux has continued to travel extensively and release more critically acclaimed books about his experiences whilst doing so. Today, at the age of 81, Theroux's thirst for travel and writing has hardly quenched. Upon reaching this old age and producing over 50 books, with over a dozen of those being travel books, Theroux has often reflected and written about the role of the travel writer and the importance of such a role. An example of this justification of his role is in an article Theroux wrote titled "Travel Writing: Why I Bother," which was published in the New York Times on July 30th, 1989. In the article, Theroux attempts to explain the seemingly pointless genre of travel writing. Theroux can only speak for himself in this instance, and concedes that it is fair to ask the question when discussing the travel book, what are they for? Theroux begins by first explaining his creative philosophy when attempting to describe the feel of a place, and says that he falls creatively in line with writer Bruce Chatwin, a man who himself would admit that he didn't know whether his own books were travel books or novels. Theroux then pulls from an excerpt from a Vladimir Nabokov novel called Laughter in the Dark that illustrates this Chatwin-like way of writing that Theroux had adopted. A writer, for instance, talks about India, which I have seen, and gushes about dancing girls, tiger hunts, fakirs, betel nuts, serpents, the glamour of the mysterious East. But what does it amount to? Nothing. Instead of visualizing India, I merely get a bad toothache from all these Eastern delights. Now, there's the other way. As for instance, the fellow who writes, "Before turning in, I put out my wet boots to dry, and in the morning I found that a thick blue forest had grown on them. Fungi, madam," he explained, "and at once India becomes alive for me. The rest is shop." Theroux then goes on to note how events in a travel book should prove a travel book's worth, but then concedes that all travel books are the individual experiences and adventures of the writer. Even two people taking the same journey will produce vastly different accounts. Next, Theroux comments on his initial opinion of the travel book as being an unclassifiable artifact. What changed this opinion, however, were the events that took place in Tiananmen Square, as Theroux believed that any truthfully and accurately written travel book about China within the former few years of the event would have pre-warned what happened. Theroux then points out how his 1988 book set in China called Riding the Iron Rooster did pre-warn the events, as Theroux made a point whilst travelling to ignore landmarks like the Great Wall of China or the Forbidden City in favour of speaking to the locals. Theroux concludes that the role of the travel writer is to report honestly and truthfully on the voices of the country the writer is in, and to not shy away from the grisly details of that country's politics. Theroux then ends the article on these lines. "I had been seriously wondering what use the travel book has, and then, with the events in Tiananmen Square, I saw that it performs a unique function. A great novel may express the soul of a country. A travel book has the capacity to express a country's heart, and perhaps the heart of a traveller too, but only as long as it stays away from vacations, holidays, sightseeing, and the half-truths in official handouts. As long as it concentrates on people in their landscape, and it includes the discomforts as well as the melodies, the contradictions, and the vivid trivia, the fungi on the wet boots, and it should go on doing it in spite of the reviewers." There are a lot of things to be taken away from these people, and a lot to be discarded. At its most fundamental form, travel is what you make it. Whether travelling for work, pleasure, or aimlessly, the act of travelling and being on the move is the overall goal, an exercise in something new. Yet, we must remember that travel is a luxury. It is not something everyone can just do. You often need time and money, both of which so few have in abundance. So dear viewer, the next time you find yourself in the rare occasion when these two elements align, travel, and if you can, travel with the advice of the aforementioned travellers in this video. Remove yourself from your comfort zone, pack lightly, eat or try something new. Speak to the locals, walk off the beaten track, go by train, not by plane, experience, and most importantly of all, go alone.